Transitioning from the theft of the present to the enclosure of the future, we execute the second phase of attention engineering, the architectural protocol known as the shadow profile. The grid does not just harvest your current attention, it aggregates your cognitive exhaust to predict and securitize your future intent. The transition from the spontaneous actor to the algorithmically predetermined bio-unit is the final systemic closure of human agency. In the 2026 extraction matrix, your future is not an open horizon. It is a financial derivative already priced and traded on the ledger. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where your own behavior is the product, and you are being kept alive only to generate the data proves the algorithm correct. At the visceral baseline, the shadow profile initiates with the total physical audit of your micro-hesitations. The human organism was evolved to read the environment through active engagement, utilizing the friction of the hunt to process data. The grid reverses this. It measures the milliseconds your eyes linger on a pixel. It tracks the speed of your scroll. It captures the subtle rise in your biometric stress markers through the interface. When you are suffering from ATP exhaustion, the algorithm detects the metabolic dip and feeds you the specific frequency of synthetic rage or digital sedation required to keep your thumb moving. You cannot perform the push-ups of resistance because the system knows exactly which image will paralyze your motor cortex. Your physical limitations are mapped. The system knows the exact temperature of the freezing rain that will break your will and the exact weight of the cold steel that your atrophied muscles can no longer lift. You are physically terraformed into a predictable equation. The neurological architecture of this predictive cage requires the total bypass of the prefrontal cortex. The grid has engineered the ultimate systemic drift of human choice. By analyzing years of your useless digital wandering, the machine has constructed a high-fidelity psychological twin. This is neural rot weaponized as an oracle. The shadow profile knows your deepest insecurities, your unvoiced traumas, and the exact threshold of your basal ganglia. Before you even consciously formulate a desire, the grid has already placed the solution in your feed, priced precisely at the limit of your credit capacity. The internal monologue is no longer the author of your life. It is merely reading a script written by the algorithm. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to act with absolute unpredictability, to pivot in the dark, is systematically erased. You are not making decisions. You are fulfilling the prophecies of the machine. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the personalized reality. The herd views the hyper-relevance of their digital world as a service, a frictionless utopia tailored to their needs. They are unaware that the personalization is actually the walls of the cage closing in. The grid converts your predictability into maximum yield. The neural pathways required for exploration, the instinct to walk into the unknown and endure the friction of the unmapped world, are demyelinated by the comfort of the echo chamber. You are a biological puppet, and the strings are woven from your own past. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the predictive grid. The ethical herd views algorithmic targeting as marketing. The predator recognizes it as a breach of sovereign intent. If the grid is designed to sell your future, the architect enforces the absolute militant obfuscation of his timeline. You do not feed the profile. You introduce chaotic, high-mass friction into your digital footprint, or you erase it entirely. You put on the heavy gloves to build the future with your own hands, offline and out of sight. You perform your push-ups in the absolute silence of the redoubt, generating kinetic energy that no algorithm can track. You let the freezing rain wash away your digital shadow. You grip the cold steel of the offline world, reminding yourself that reality is forged in the dirt, not in the feed. The herd will call this paranoia or technophobia. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity with free will is the one that the machine cannot predict. The system wants a population of perfectly mapped open-book ghosts whose every move is profitable. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the dark node. The shadow profile is the death of human spontaneity. The architect refuses the scan. The future belongs to the unpredictable. The ledger is closed. The traditional definition of shelter is a systemic trap designed to mask the terminal enclosure of human geography. You have been conditioned to view the smart home as the pinnacle of domestic evolution, a frictionless environment of voice-controlled lighting and biometric locks. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of redoubt architecture. architecture, the physical blueprint for sovereign space in the 2026 extraction matrix. The grid does not build 15-minute cities for your convenience, it builds them to minimize the thermodynamic cost of monitoring your existence. The transition from the independent homestead to the integrated pod is the definitive systemic enclosure of human physics. You are occupying a zone where your physical coordinates are leased from the machine, and your walls are simply the outer membrane of your digital cage. At the visceral baseline, this architectural enclosure initiates with the total decoupling of the human organism from the raw elements. The human body was evolved to calibrate its density against the hard physics of the earth, enduring the freezing rain to harden the skin, utilizing the heavy gloves to shape the terrain, and maintaining muscle mass through the constant friction of survival. The 2026 grid seeks to induce a state of permanent ATP exhaustion by engineering the environment for absolute sedentary comfort. This is the first layer of redoubt architecture, the rejection of climate control. When you live in a thermally regulated pod, your body ceases to generate its own heat. The biological capacity to perform the push-ups of the architect or to forge the cold steel of resistance is neutralized by the constant 22 degrees Celsius of the containment zone. You are physically terraformed into a liquid state, structurally incapable of defending a perimeter because your biology has forgotten how to be hard. The neurological architecture of this enclosure requires the absolute saturation of the living space with the mesh network. The prefrontal cortex is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the permanent hum of Wi-Fi frequencies, Bluetooth handshakes, and smart meter surveillance. This is the phenomenon of neural rot built directly into the drywall. The home is no longer a sanctuary, it is a data harvesting terminal. The basal ganglia are hijacked by the convenience of the interface, rendering the node cognitively incapable of offline survival. The internal monologue is suppressed by the constant noise of the algorithmic landlord. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to plan a decade-long strategy in absolute silence, is systematically erased by a house that listens to your every breath. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap, the hyper-efficient tier. The herd views their low-carbon, high-density pods as a moral victory. They pay a premium for the sustainable building materials that degrade in a decade, unaware that they are literally buying the expiration date of their own shelter. They call it eco-minimalism. The grid calls it the total reclamation of physical space. The system converts your desire for a home into a perpetual rent extraction. The neural pathways required for territorial sovereignty, the instinct to mark a boundary in the dirt and defend it with violence, are demyelinated by the shared wall reality of the hive. You are a biological tenant, terrified of making a noise that the sensors might flag. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the urban grid. The ethical herd views off-grid living as primitive. The predator recognizes it as the only viable physics of survival. The architect enforces the absolute militant crystallization of his territory. You do not lease the pod. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to secure the untracked land. You build the redoubt not for aesthetics, but for mass. You use the heavy metal. You line the walls with grounded copper and lead to create a dead zone, a Faraday cage where the mesh network fails and the algorithmic noise is silenced. You put on the heavy gloves to mix the concrete yourself. You perform your push-ups in the mud of your own perimeter. You let the freezing rain test the integrity of the roof. You install blast doors of cold steel, not to lock yourself in, but to lock the simulation out. The herd will call this bunker mentality or doomsday paranoia. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only space you truly own is the space you can defend without an internet connection. The system wants a population of perfectly contained ghosts living in glass boxes. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the high-mass redoubt, the architecture of the rust aesthetic, the grit, the oxidized metal, the brutalist concrete, is not a style. It is the physical manifestation of entropy denied. The redoubt is the final anchor of the human species. The simulation evaporates. The smart grid collapses under its own weight, but the concrete holds. The world belongs to the heavy walls. The silicon melts, but the rust remains. The traditional definition of social cohesion is a systemic camouflage designed to mask the terminal homogenization of the human psyche. You have been conditioned to view the crowd as a collection of independent minds, a community of peers. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of Crowd Psychology 2026, the architectural protocol for identifying the liquid bio-unit within the extraction matrix. The grid does not connect people to foster culture. It aggregates them into a unified thermal mass to lower the processing cost of surveillance. The transition from the sovereign individual to the hive-minded ghost is the definitive system systemic enclosure of human psychology. In the 2026 grid, your neighbor is not a fellow citizen. They are a low-level biological sensor deployed by the machine. You are occupying a thermodynamic zone where the surrounding biomass is actively utilized to enforce your containment. At the visceral baseline, this psychological enclosure initiates with the visible display of biological surrender. The liquid node is easily identified by the physical markers of permanent ATP exhaustion. The human organism was evolved to project mass and intent, holding a posture ready for the friction of the hunt. The grid has terraformed the crowd into a state of musculoskeletal collapse. You observe the aversion to the raw elements. They avoid the freezing rain at all costs, scurrying between climate-controlled pods. The biological capacity for the push-ups of resistance is gone. Their hands are too soft for the heavy gloves of creation. They flinch at the sight of cold steel. They are physically incapable of violence, and thus they have outsourced their protection entirely to the algorithms of the state. The liquid is a creature of absolute comfort, structurally allergic to the hard physics of reality. The neurological architecture of the herd requires the absolute synchronization of the basal ganglia. The prefrontal cortex of the crowd is subjected to total systemic drift, managed through the real-time feedback loop of the social credit interface. This is the phenomenon of neural rot manifested as peer pressure. Through the grid, the nodes are taught to self-police. The internal monologue is suppressed, replaced by the collective hum of the verified consensus. The status trap is the fear of social isolation. The liquid will betray their own bloodline to maintain their position within the simulation. The capacity for the last hunt, the ability to stand alone against the current and endure the silence of the unapproved thought, is systematically demyelinated. The crowd does not think, it merely propagates the signal it receives. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining diagnostic tool, the anomaly audit. The herd views the identification of dissenters as a moral duty, an act of protecting the safety of the collective. They pay a premium for the biometric apps that allow them to report suspicious offline behavior. They call it civic responsibility. The grid calls it the distributed immune system of the machine. The system converts the cowardice of the individual into a collective weapon. The neural pathways required for loyalty and omerta, the foundational laws of the phalanx, are successfully overwritten by the dopamine of the informant. You are surrounded by biological tripwires, terrified ghosts who will flag your existence the moment you deviate from the script. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the social grid. The ethical herd views isolation as a pathology. The predator recognizes the crowd as a contamination zone. If the grid is designed to use the herd as a weapon, the architect enforces the absolute militant crystallization of his social circle. You do not network. You do not integrate. You endure the massive cognitive friction required to vet every potential member of your pack. You put on the heavy gloves to handle the toxic waste of human weakness, discarding the liquids without hesitation. You test your circle in the freezing rain of financial and physical stress. You only allow those who can do the push-ups of resistance and grip the cold steel of loyalty to enter the redoubt. The herd will call this sociopathy or exclusionary extremism. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity you can trust is the one that has proven its immunity to the simulation. The system wants a population of perfectly merged, transparent ghosts who share a single, predictable mind. The architect builds the impenetrable empire of the sovereign pack. Crowd psychology is the operating system of the prey. The architect observes the movement of the herd only to calculate the trajectory of the slaughter. The predator stands apart. The phalanx is locked. The collective dissolves.